Humans were thought to be myths. Then we took the front line. Part 1. The old stories. The galaxy was old. It had been mapped, charted, explored, and settled for longer than most species could remember. Over 40 intelligent species had found each other among the stars, and together they had formed the Galactic Coalition, a fragile, imperfect, but enduring alliance built on trade, shared knowledge, and the simple desire to not die alone in the dark. Every species in the coalition had its legends. The Tyranni told stories of ghost ships that sailed through nebulae. The Kravari believed in ancient gods who slept inside dead stars, and the Velhari, the oldest and most scholarly of all the species, kept records of something else, something stranger, somewhere in the far western spiral arm of the galaxy, in a region no one had ever bothered to explore because the stars there were small and dim and uninteresting. There was supposed to be a species unlike any other. They called them humans. The stories were scattered and old. Deep Space Probe had picked up faint radio signals centuries ago, primitive broadcasts full of music and voices, speaking a language no one understood. Another probe sent closer had returned, damaged, its outer hull scored with marks that suggested it had been grabbed by something physical, something with hands. The data it carried was corrupted, but fragments remained, audio recordings of creatures that seemed to laugh, visual distortions that hinted at a world of blue and green covered in water, a universal solvent that should have dissolved organic life but somehow didn't. The Velhari scientists who studied these fragments published a brief paper, classified the findings as anomalous and unverified, and filed them away in the deepest level of their archives under a single word: mythology. No one went to check. The western arm was far away, the signals were old, and the galaxy had bigger problems. Biggest problem had a name: the Draken. Dominion. The Draken were insected, tall, armored, cold, and efficient. They did not join the coalition. They did not trade. They did not negotiate. They consumed. For decades they had been expanding outward from their home territory, swallowing border worlds one by one. Their fleets were massive. Their soldiers were fearless, and their strategy was simple: overwhelm, occupy, strip the resources, and move on. The coalition fought back, but it was losing, slowly, steadily, and undeniably losing. Sareth knew this better than most. She was a young Velhari intelligence officer, stationed at Coalition Command on the world of Fessala. She was tall and thin, with silver-blue skin and large dark eyes that had spent too many hours staring at data screens. Her job was to find advantages, anything the Coalition could use to slow the Draken advance, new weapons forgotten, alliances, old technology, anything. She was running out of places to look. One evening, deep into a shift that had already lasted 14 hours, she found herself in the lowest levels of the Coalition archive. The files down here were ancient, most of them untouched for centuries. She scrolled through records of extinct species, failed experiments, and abandoned colonies. And then she found a file tagged with a word she didn't recognize. Humans. She opened it. The file was thin, just a handful of probe reports, some audio fragments, and a few speculative notes written by a Velhari researcher who had been dead for 300 years. The notes described a species that breathed oxygen, a gas so reactive that most coalition species considered it corrosive and dangerous. A species that drank water in its liquid form, a species that lived on a planet with active tectonic plates, violent weather systems, and a gravity pull nearly twice the coalition average. Sarith almost laughed. The planet described in the file sounded like a punishment, not a home. No intelligent species could evolve in conditions like that. It had to be a mistake or a joke or a legend that had been taken too seriously by a lonely researcher with too much time. She closed the file and moved on. 3 days later, the coalition lost another border system. The Drakari had hit the Verath corridor, one of the last defensive lines protecting the inner worlds. 2 coalition fleets had been destroyed. 11 million civilians were now under Drakari occupation. The War Council met in emergency session, and the mood was the darkest Sarith had ever seen. Councillor Tyvan, one of the oldest members of the War Council, sat at the head of the table. He was Velhari like Sarith, but ancient. His silver skin had faded to pale gray, and his eyes were clouded with age, but his mind was still sharp. After the briefing, when the generals and admirals had finished listing everything they had lost and everything they couldn't hold, Tyvan turned to Sarith. You have been searching the archives. It was not a question. Yes, Counselor. Have you found anything? Sarith hesitated. She thought of the human file. She thought of the absurd planet with its crushing gravity and its corrosive atmosphere and its creatures that laughed on audio recordings. Nothing credible, she said. Tyvan looked at her for a long moment. His expression was calm, but there was something behind it, something desperate. Sarith, he said quietly, we are past the point of credible. I need you to follow every lead, every rumor, every myth, if there is even the smallest chance that something out there can help us. I need to know about it. She nodded. That night she went back to the archive and opened the human file. Again she read every word. She listened to every audio fragment, and then, against her better judgment, she authorized the launch of a long-range scout probe toward the coordinates listed in the oldest record, a small, unremarkable star system on the far edge of the western spiral arm. The system was called Sol. The probe would take weeks to arrive. Sarith filed her report, marked it as low priority, and went back to work on more realistic options. She did not expect anything to come of it. She did not expect a response. She certainly did not expect the response to come in 11 days in a language the probe's own systems had been used to decode, clear and confident and unmistakable. We hear you. What do you need? Sarith read the message 3 times. Then she stood up from her chair, walked to Counselor Tyvan's office and knocked on the door. Counselor, she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. The myths are real. Humans were thought to be myths. Then we took the Frontline, H2 Part 2 First Contact. The message sat on the screen for 6 hours before anyone on the Coalition War Council believed it was real. Sarith played it for them 4 times. She showed them the probe telemetry. She showed them the signal analysis. She showed them the decryption logs that proved beyond any doubt that whoever had sent the reply had taken apart the probe's communication system, learned how it worked, rebuilt its language structure from scratch, and sent back a perfectly formatted response. All in less than 2 weeks. The room was silent. "That is not possible," said Admiral Korath, a tyranny officer with deep green scales and a reputation for never being impressed by anything. "No species decodes an unknown language in 11 days. "These ones did," Sirith said. "On Earth, the year was 2387. And the morning the alien probe arrived was a Tuesday. Humanity had come a long way since it first left its home planet. There were colonies on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and mining stations scattered across the asteroid belt. Earth itself was crowded, noisy, and still arguing about everything, which was more or less how it had always been. But for all their expansion, humans had never found another intelligent species. They had looked, they had listened. They had sent probes and signals and messages into the dark, and the dark had never answered. Until now. The probe was picked up by a deep space monitoring station near Neptune. It was small, clearly artificial, and broadcasting on frequencies no human technology used. Within hours, it was brought to the orbital research platform above Earth. And within a day, the best minds on the planet were studying it. Captain Danny Ortega got the call at 3:00 in the morning. He was career Navy, 46 years old, with a square jaw and a calm voice that made people trust him even when he was telling them things they didn't want to hear. He had served on patrol ships, command vessels, and border stations. He had never expected to be put in charge of first contact with alien life. But the people above him decided he was steady enough to handle it, and that was that. Dr. Lisa Vance got the call 20 minutes later. She was a xenolinguist, someone who studied the theory of alien languages. For most of her career, this had been a purely academic exercise since there were no alien languages to actually study. She had written papers, given lectures, and been politely ignored by almost everyone. Now she was the most important person on Earth, and she hadn't even had her coffee yet. Together, Danny and Lisa led a team of 40 researchers and military personnel. The orbital station Unity. Their job was simple: figure out who sent the probe, what they wanted, and whether they were friendly. Lisa cracked the language in 11 days. Later, she would say it wasn't as hard as people thought. The probe's communication system was designed to be understood, which meant whoever built it wanted to be found. The grammar was mathematical, the symbols were logical, and once she found the key, the rest fell into place like a that had been waiting to be solved. The message they sent back was Danny's idea. Lisa had wanted something longer, something more formal. Danny said, "No, keep it short. Keep it honest. We hear you. What do you need?" The reply came 3 weeks later. It was longer this time, much longer. It described a galaxy full of intelligent life, an alliance of species, and a war that was being lost. It described the Drakari, their fleets, their conquests, and the millions of lives at stake. And it ended with a simple, almost hesitant request. "Will you help?" Danny read the message in the command room of Unity Station, surrounded by his team. The room was quiet. Lisa stood beside him, her eyes red from lack of sleep, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Well," Danny said, "that's not what I expected." The coalition sent a Diplomatic envoy, 3 ships small and elegant, carrying a team led by Sarath. Herself, she had volunteered partly because she felt responsible and partly because she was the only person in the coalition who had actually studied the human files. She was as prepared as anyone could be. She was not prepared. The human solar system was loud, radio. Signals bounced between planets and stations in a constant, chaotic stream. Music, news, arguments, laughter, all of it overlapping in a wall of noise that made Sarath's communication officer physically flinch. As they approached Earth, Sarath looked at the planet through the observation window and felt something close to dread. It was beautiful in a violent sort of way. Blue oceans, green continents, white clouds swirling over everything. But her ship sensors told a different story. Tectonic activity across multiple fault lines. Atmospheric oxygen levels that would be toxic to half the species in the coalition. Surface gravity strong enough to crush a Velhari if they weren't careful, and the biodiversity readings were overwhelming. Millions of species, many of them predatory, all of them competing in a constant brutal struggle for survival. How do they live here? Her science officer whispered. I don't think they had a choice, Sira said. They docked at Unity Station. Danny met them at the airlock with a small team of officers and scientists. Sira had studied images of humans, but seeing one in person was different. Danny was shorter than her, but wider. Denser, he moved with a weight and solidity that made the deck feel different under his feet. When he smiled, he showed his teeth, a gesture that in most coalition species would be a threat display. Lisa stood beside him, smaller, quieter, but with eyes that watched everything. Danny held out his hand. Sira had been briefed on this custom, a greeting that involved gripping another person's hand and shaking it. His grip was warm and firm, and she could feel the strength in it, even though he was clearly being gentle. Welcome to Saul, he said. You must be tired. Can I get you something to drink? He brought her coffee. Her bioscanner analyzed it immediately and flagged it as a mild stimulant. Toxin caffeine, a chemical that would have put a Torani into cardiac distress. She watched Danny drink his without hesitation, the dark liquid steaming in his cup. You drink poison for pleasure, she said. It was not a question. Danny looked at his mug, then back at her. I guess we do, he said. Wait until you hear about alcohol. Over the next 3 days, Sirath presented the coalition situation. She showed them star maps. She showed them footage of Drakari attacks. She showed them the casualty figures. She did not exaggerate because she did not need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Danny listened to everything. He asked questions, sharp, specific questions about fleet sizes, weapon types, defensive capabilities, and supply lines. Lisa asked about the species involved, their cultures, their histories. Sirath answered everything as honestly as she could. When it was over, Danny sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked tired but not overwhelmed. He looked like a man who had just been given a very large problem and was already figuring out how to solve it. I can't make this decision alone, he said. I need to take this to my government, but I'll tell you what I told my crew. If someone asks for help and we can give it, then we should. Sirath nodded. She did not fully understand these people yet. They were strange and loud, and they drank poison, and lived on a death world and showed their teeth when they were happy. But there was something in Danny's voice when he said those words that she understood perfectly. He meant it. Humans were thought to be myths then. We took the front line. Part 3: The Decision. The debate lasted 2 weeks. It was broadcast across every colony, every station, and every settlement in human space. People argued about it in government halls, in cafeterias, in living rooms, and on the streets of every city from New York to the Mars domes. The question was simple. The answer was not, should humanity go to war for species it had never met in a galaxy it had barely begun to understand. The United Earth Council met in Geneva, in the same building where humans had been arguing about their future for over 400 years. The council chamber was old, with high ceilings and wooden panels that smelled like history. Representatives from every colony and territory sat in rows that curved around a central floor, and on that floor Captain Danny Ortega stood beside Dr. Lisa Vance and told them everything. He told them about the coalition, 40 species, hundreds of worlds, billions of lives. He told them about the Drakari, their fleets, their tactics, their total unwillingness to negotiate or coexist. He told them about the border worlds that had already fallen and the ones that would fall next. He showed them footage that Sirith had provided, cities burning under orbital bombardment, refugee convoys fleeing through space, coalition ships breaking apart under Drakari fire. The chamber was quiet when he finished. Then the arguments began. Some said it was not humanity's fight. Earth had its own problems, resources were limited, they had no faster than light technology, no experience with galactic warfare, and no obligation to anyone out there. Getting involved in someone else's war was how empires fell. Others said the opposite. If the Drakari won, if they consumed the entire coalition, what would stop them from eventually finding Earth? The galaxy was big, but not infinite. Better to face this threat now with allies than later alone. Commander Nate Herrera spoke on the third day. He was Earth Marine Corps, 40 years old, with a shaved head and arms that looked like they had been built for carrying heavy things over long distances. He had served in 3 territorial conflicts and had a reputation for being blunt to the point of rudeness. He stood on the council floor and did not use notes. I've listened to 3 days of people explaining why we should stay home, he said, and I understand the arguments. I do. But here's what keeps me up at night. We spent centuries looking up at the stars and asking if anyone was out there. Now we know they're out there and they're dying, and they asked us for help. If we say no, if we lock our doors and close our eyes and pretend we never heard them, then what were we even looking for? The vote passed by a narrow margin. Humanity would help. The next 6 months were the busiest human history. The coalition provided faster-than-light drive technology. It was elegant, complex, and centuries ahead of anything humans had built. Human engineers took it apart, studied it, understood it, and then started bolting it onto every ship they had. The coalition engineers who watched this process were horrified. Humans did not integrate technology gracefully. They forced it. They welded FTL drives onto warships that were never designed for them, ran cables through corridors that were too small, and reinforced hulls with extra plating that made the ships heavier and uglier, but also harder to kill. In return, humanity offered something the Coalition had never seen: kinetic weapons. The Coalition fought with energy. Weapons, plasma lances, particle beams, disruption fields. These were precise, efficient, and powerful. Every species in the Coalition used them, and every species in the Coalition had built defenses against them: energy shields, absorption plating, dispersal grids. The entire doctrine of galactic warfare was built around energy-based combat. Humans didn't use energy weapons. Humans used railguns, electromagnetic launchers that accelerated solid metal slugs to extraordinary speeds. A railgun round was simple. It was a piece of tungsten, dense and heavy, moving very fast. It had no frequency to absorb, no energy signature to disperse, no beam to deflect. It was just mass and velocity, and when it hit something, that something broke. Lisa worked with Siroth to bridge the gap between human and Coalition military doctrine. It was not easy. The Coalition fought in formations, neat, ordered, predictable. Their tactics were built on mathematics and probability. They calculated optimal firing angles, maintained precise distances, and followed established patterns that had been refined over centuries. Nate looked at their battle plans and shook his head. The Drakari know these patterns too. He said, that's why they're winning. You're fighting the same way every time. And they've figured you out. He introduced the Coalition officers to human military concepts that had no direct translation in any alien language: flanking maneuvers, ambush tactics, combined arms warfare, the idea that infantry, armor, artillery, and support should work together as a single, flexible force rather than as separate units following separate plans, feints, diversions, and the deliberate use of chaos as a weapon. The Coalition officers listened politely, and then expressed concern that these tactics seemed reckless, undisciplined, and likely to result in friendly casualties. Nate smiled. That's why they work, he said. Earth shipyards ran day and night. The flagship of the new fleet was the S. Longhorn, a heavy cruiser that had originally been built for asteroid defense. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was a thick armored block of metal with a main rail gun that ran the entire length of its spine, and enough secondary weapons to make a Drakari dreadnought nervous. When Siroth first saw it on a display screen, she said it looked like a weapon pretending to be a ship. That's the nicest thing anyone said about her, Danny said. He had volunteered for Frontline command. His superiors told him he was too valuable. He told them he wasn't asking permission. The volunteer force assembled at the Mars orbital yards, 12,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines from every corner of human space. They came from cities and farms, from stations and colonies, from families that had been military for generations and families that had never held a weapon. Among them was Corporal Maggie Ruiz. She was 26, from San Antonio, Texas. She was a combat engineer trained to build things, break things, and keep people alive while doing both. She was not tall. She was not loud. She had brown eyes, calloused hands, and a habit of humming old songs when she was nervous. When a reporter asked her why she volunteered, she thought about it for a moment. Someone out there asked for help, she said. I've got 2 hands and I know how to use them. Doesn't seem right to sit this one out. The fleet gathered at the edge of the solar system. 47 ships, retrofitted and armed, crewed by people who had never left their own star system before. They were about to jump across the galaxy into a war they barely understood, against an enemy they had never seen, alongside allies they had only just met. Danny stood on the bridge of the Longhorn and looked at the stars through the forward viewport. Lisa was beside him, her tablet clutched to her chest, her face pale but determined. Behind them, the bridge crew worked their stations with the focused calm of people who had made their decision and were done being afraid. Nate's voice came through the fleet-wide channel from the marine transport ship. Behind them, all units, this is Commander Herrera. We are go for jump. I won't make a big speech. You all know why we're here. Let's go do what humans do. Danny gave the order. The FTL drives engaged, and for the first time in history, humanity left its home behind. Somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, Cirrus sat in her office on Thesara, staring at a message she had just sent to Counselor Tyven. It was short: the myths are real, and they are coming. She didn't know if that should make her hopeful or afraid. She decided it was both. Humans were thought to be myths. Then we took the front line. Part 4. The front line. The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at Varith Prime on a Wednesday, though no one on board was counting days anymore. What they saw through the viewports was enough to make every person on every ship go quiet for a moment. Varith Prime was burning. The planet hung in space like a bruised fruit, its atmosphere streaked with orange and black where orbital bombardment had set entire regions on fire. Around it, the wreckage of a coalition defense fleet drifted in a slow, silent graveyard, shattered hulls leaking atmosphere, emergency beacons blinking uselessly in the dark. And beyond the wreckage, arranged in a wide arc like a predator circling a dying animal, was the Dracari fleet. There were over 100 Dracari ships, dreadnoughts, cruisers, carriers, assault transports. Their hulls were dark and angular, covered in ridged armor that made them look like enormous insects. Their weapons glowed a sickly green as they continued their bombardment of the surface, methodical and unhurried. They had already won this battle. They were just finishing the job. Danny stood on the bridge of the Longhorn and took it all in. He had seen combat before: border skirmishes, pirate interdictions, the kind of small, contained violence that humanity had practiced on itself for centuries. This was different. This was a slaughter on a scale he had never imagined. He opened the fleet channel. His voice was steady. All ships, this is Longhorn Actual. I know what you're seeing. I see it. 2. There are still people alive down there, millions of them, coalition civilians who are counting on someone to show up. That's us. We're going to break through that fleet. We're going to stop the bombardment, and we're going to get those people out. Questions? There were no questions. Good. All ships, battle formation Delta. Weapons free on my command. The Dracari noticed the new arrivals, but they didn't react with alarm. Their tactical systems flagged the human ships as unknown, small, crude, and using technology signatures that didn't match any species in their database. The Dracari fleet commander assigned a screening force of 12 ships to deal with Them, it should have been more than enough. It was not enough. The Longhorn fired first, its main rail gun, a magnetic accelerator that ran the full length of the ship's spine, discharged a solid tungsten slug, weighing 400 kg at a velocity that made it glow white-hot from air friction in the barrel. The slug crossed the distance between the fleets in less than 2 seconds. It hit the lead Dracari cruiser directly in the center of its hull. The ship's energy shields, designed to absorb and disperse plasma fire and particle beams, did nothing. They were built to stop energy. The railgun slug was not energy. It was metal, simple, dense, and moving at a speed that turned it into something close to a natural disaster. The slug punched through the shields, through the armor, through the interior of the ship, and out the other side. The cruiser broke in half. Its reactor went critical. The explosion lit up the void like a second sun. The Dracari screening force stopped advancing. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then every human ship in the fleet opened fire at once. The battle that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever recorded. The Dracari fought in patterns, established formations, coordinated salvos, mathematical precision. They were good at it. They had conquered dozens of worlds with these tactics. The humans fought like water. They flowed around obstacles, filled gaps, and hit from directions that shouldn't have been possible. Nate coordinated the marine assault from the transport ship behind the main line. He watched the battle on a tactical display, barking orders that would have sounded insane to any coalition. Commander, 3rd Wing, break formation and go low. 4th Wing, cut engines and drift. Let them think you're dead, then hit their flank. Longhorn, draw their fire. Make them angry. Danny made them angry. The Longhorn charged straight into the heart of the Dracari formation, firing its rail guns in every direction, taking hits that would have destroyed a coalition ship, but only dented the Longhorn's reinforced hull. The Dracari focused their fire on it, exactly as Nate wanted, while their attention was on the Longhorn. 3 wings of human ships swept around and hit their bombardment line from behind. The bombardment of Verith Prime stopped. On the surface, things were worse. The capital city of Verith Prime was a ruin. Buildings had collapsed, fires burned in every district and Dracari ground. Troops 8 ft tall, covered in natural chitinous armor, armed with plasma rifles, were moving through the streets, rounding up survivors. Maggie Ruiz hit the ground in a drop pod that punched through the atmosphere like a bullet. The landing was rough. The pod's braking thrusters fired too late, and she hit the surface hard, enough to rattle her teeth and crack the screen of her wrist display. She kicked the hatch open, rolled out into the dust, and looked around. The city was a nightmare. Smoke everywhere, the sound of weapons fire in the distance. Coalition civilians, Velhari, Tarani, Kriavari, species she had only seen in briefing photos, were running through the streets, terrified, trying to find anywhere safe. There was nowhere safe. Maggie's squad was 12 people, combat engineers, all of them. Their job was simple on paper and impossible in practice. Secure the main bridge over the Varath River so that civilians could cross to the evacuation zone on the other side. They reached the bridge in 20 minutes, moving through burning streets and dodging debris. The bridge was long, wide, and exposed. On the far side was a coalition landing field where evacuation shuttles were waiting. Between the bridge and the shuttles was open ground, and between Maggie's squad and the bridge was a Drackery patrol. The Drackery were terrifying up close. Their armor was not worn, it was grown. Part of their bodies, thick plates of chitin that covered their torsos and limbs, their eyes were black and compound, seeing in every direction at once. They moved with a clicking, mechanical precision that made Maggie's skin crawl. They were also not expecting humans. Maggie's squad hit the patrol from two sides with kinetic rifles and fragmentation grenades. The Drackery were fast and tough, but they had never fought anything like this. Humans moved differently. They ducked, rolled, used cover in ways that the Drackery tactical programming didn't anticipate. The patrol went down in less than 3 minutes. Then the real fight started. The Drackery sent reinforcements. Maggie's squad dug in at the near end of the bridge and held. The first wave came 30 minutes later. 20 Drac soldiers advancing in a tight formation across the open ground. Maggie's engineers had spent that 30 minutes doing what engineers do best. They had mined the approach, set up overlapping fields of fire, and turned a stretch of open road into a kill zone. The first wave broke. The second wave came an hour later. Bigger. It broke too, but not before Maggie lost 2 of her people. Corporal Eddie Santos took a plasma bolt through his shoulder and kept firing with one arm until a medic pulled him back. Private Kelly Marsh didn't make it at all. She was 22. Maggie didn't have time to grieve. Behind her, coalition civilians were streaming across the bridge, hundreds of them, then thousands, old and young. Families carrying whatever they could hold, children crying, adults silent, with the blank look of people who had lost everything. Velhari medics moved among them, guiding them toward the shuttles. One of them, a young Velhari medic named Pell, stopped beside Maggie during a lull in the fighting. He was shaking. His silver-blue skin was smudged with ash. It was not a question. "That's us," Maggie said. She handed him a canteen of water. He looked at it like she was handing him liquid fire, which from his perspective she was. "Why are you here?" he asked. Maggie looked at the bridge, at the civilians still crossing, at the smoke and the fire and the distant sound of Drac reinforcements gathering for another push. "Because you needed us to be," she said. The Drac attacked the bridge 6 more times over the next 9 hours. Maggie's squad held it every single time. By the end, they were down to 8 people, low on ammunition, running on stimulants and stubbornness. Maggie had a piece of shrapnel in her left leg that she hadn't had time to remove. She had stopped counting how many Dracari she had killed somewhere around hour 4. But the bridge held, and 17,000 coalition civilians made it to the evacuation shuttles. Above them, the space battle was ending. The Dracari fleet, shattered and confused by tactics they had never encountered and weapons they had no defense against, was pulling back. It was not a retreat. The Dracari did not retreat, but it was the next closest thing. When the last evacuation shuttle lifted off the surface of Vereth Prime, Danny Ortega sat down in his command chair for the first time in 14 hours and let out a breath he felt like he had been holding since they left Saul. "Get me a casualty count," he said quietly. It was bad. They had lost 7 ships and 431 people, but the Drekari had lost 38 ships and the battle, for the first time in 3 years, the coalition had won. When the footage reached the rest of the galaxy, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Species that had dismissed humans as legends watched shaky combat recordings of small, dense creatures charging into Drekari fire, holding positions that should have been impossible to hold and fighting with a ferocity that made even the coalition's own soldiers look on in disbelief. Sirith watched the recordings alone in her office. She watched Maggie hold the bridge. She watched the Longhorn charge the Drekari line. She watched humans drag wounded coalition soldiers to safety, share their rations with refugees, and stand in the ruins of a city that wasn't theirs, on a planet they had never seen before, fighting for people they had only just met. She made a note in her file, one line: "They don't fight like soldiers, they fight like survivors." Humans were thought to be myths. Then we took the front line. Part 5: The Turning Tide. The news of Vareth Prime spread across the galaxy like fire. Every coalition species heard the story. Every news channel, every communication network, every whispered conversation in every corner of civilized space carried the same unbelievable message: the myths were real, and they had just won a battle that everyone thought was already lost. For the Drekari, it was something they had never experienced before: confusion. The Drekari Dominion had been waging war for over a century, and in that time they had developed a simple and effective understanding of how the galaxy fought. Energy weapons, energy shields, formation-based tactics. Every species did it. The math was clean, the outcomes were predictable. The Drekari had built their entire military doctrine around exploiting these patterns, and it had worked so well that most of their commanders had never even considered the possibility that someone might fight differently. Now they were staring at combat data from Vareth Prime, and none of it made sense. Ships that broke formation on purpose, weapons that ignored energy shields, ground troops that refused to fall back, even when the tactical situation demanded it, and a species, small, soft, unarmored, that had somehow held a bridge against 6 consecutive assault waves with nothing but projectile weapons and what their analysts could only describe as an irrational refusal to die. The Drekari High Command ordered a strategic pause for the first time in the war. They needed to study these new enemies. They needed to adapt. Nate Herrera had no intention of giving them the time. "They're off balance," he said during the Joint Command meeting aboard the Longhorn. The room was crowded. Human officers sat alongside coalition commanders, a mix of species that had never shared a war room before. Cirrus was there too, acting as liaison. Right now, the Drekari are trying to figure out what happened. They're pulling back, regrouping, running analysis. If we hit them now, before they adapt, we can break their supply lines and push them out of the border systems. The coalition commanders were uneasy. Admiral Koreth, the Tyranny officer who had doubted the human message months ago, spoke carefully. "Our doctrine calls for consolidation after a victory. But right now, we face the question of timing. How long can we wait before the Drekari adapt? We reinforce our position, repair our fleet, and prepare for the next Engagement. With respect, Admiral, Nate said, and his tone made it clear he was trying very hard to be respectful. Your doctrine is why you are losing. The Drakari expect you to consolidate. They've built their strategy around your predictability. The best thing we can do right now is be unpredictable. Counselor Tyven, who had been listening quietly from the back of the room, stood up. He was old and frail, but when he spoke, every officer in the room turned to listen. I have spent 40 years watching this coalition lose a war slowly and politely, he said. We followed our doctrine, we maintained our formations, we did everything correctly, and we lost world after world. These humans have been here for one battle, and they have given us our first victory in 3 years. He paused and looked at Nate. Let them fight the way they know how. The counteroffensive began 4 days later. It was brutal, fast, and nothing like how the coalition had ever waged war. Human ships hit Draken supply convoys in ambush attacks, dropping out of FTL in the middle of shipping lanes, firing everything they had and jumping away before the escorts could respond. Marine strike teams landed on occupied worlds in small, fast operations designed to sabotage Draken infrastructure and support local resistance. Maggie was in the thick of it. She had been promoted to sergeant after Varith Prime, not because she wanted the rank, but because half the people above her were either dead or recovering. Her squad, rebuilt with a mix of human, Marines, and coalition volunteers, hit 3 worlds in the first month. The coalition soldiers who fought alongside humans learned quickly. They learned that humans didn't sleep on schedule. They slept when they could and fought when they had to, sometimes for 30 or 40 hours straight. They learned that humans shared everything: food, water, ammunition, warmth, without being asked. They learned that humans gave their weapons names, talked to their equipment, and sang songs while they worked that made no tactical sense but somehow made everyone feel better. Maggie learned things too. She learned the names of every alien soldier in her unit. There was Pell, the Valhari medic from Varith Prime, who had refused to leave her side after the bridge. There was Torek, a Krivari heavy gunner who was twice her height and 3 times her weight, but followed her orders without hesitation after watching her charge a Drakari position armed with nothing but a sidearm and a handful of grenades. There was Sergeant Vorin, a tyranny officer who initially resented taking orders from a human half his age, but came around after Maggie personally carried a wounded tyranny soldier 2 km across open ground to a medical station, while enemy fire burned the air around. Sorry. She carried Pell once too. On the second world they hit, a frozen mining colony called Kesset Station. Pell took a piece of shrapnel in his side during an ambush. He was lighter than a human, which made carrying him easier, but his blood was a different color, and Maggie didn't know if the pressure she was applying was helping or hurting. She carried him anyway, talking to him the whole time, telling him about San Antonio and the Riverwalk and how her mother made tamales at Christmas. Pell didn't understand half of what she said, but he held on to her and listened. And by the time they reached the medical station, he was still alive. The coalition retook 4 border worlds in 2 months. The Drakari, still struggling to adapt to human tactics, were being pushed back faster than they had advanced in years. Then came the Battle of Korath Nebula. The Drakari High Command faced with the first serious threat to their expansion in living memory made a decision. They gathered every available ship, every dreadnought, every carrier, every cruiser and destroyer they could pull from garrison duty, and sent them to the Korath Nebula in a single massive strike designed to destroy the combined human coalition fleet once and for all. It was the largest fleet action in recorded galactic history. Over 300 Draken ships against a combined force of 60 human ships and 90 coalition vessels. The numbers were bad. Danny Ortega didn't care about the numbers. The battle lasted 19 hours. It was fought across a volume of space so large that light from one end of the engagement took minutes to reach the other. Ships burned and died in flashes that looked like stars being born and extinguished in the same breath. The Longhorn was in the center of it, as always. Danny had positioned her at the tip of the formation, drawing fire, anchoring the line. By hour 10, the Longhorn had taken more damage than any ship in the fleet. Her port railgun batteries were gone. Her secondary hull was breached in 3 places. Fires burned in her lower decks, and her crew was fighting them with extinguishers and bare hands between firing solutions. Danny stayed on the bridge. He had a cut above his left eye that wouldn't stop bleeding, and he had stopped noticing it around hour 6. Lisa was beside him, not because she had any business being on a warship bridge during a battle, but because she had refused to leave. And Danny had learned months ago that arguing with Lisa was a waste of time. Their center is weakening, Lisa said, reading the tactical display with an analyst's eye. The formation is spreading. If we push now. I see it, Danny said. He opened the fleet channel. All ships, this is Longhorn actual. I need everything you have on there. Center. Every ship that can still fight, every gun that can still fire. Hit them now, hit them hard, don't stop until they break. The combined fleet surged forward, human railguns and coalition plasma lances fired together in a wall of destruction that tore into the Draken center. Nate's Marines, deployed on boarding pods, crashed into the hulls of Draken command ships and fought room to room through corridors that were never designed for humans. Too dark, too narrow, too hot. They fought anyway. In hour 17, the Draken flagship, an enormous dreadnought called the Varaxis, took a direct hit from the Longhorn's main railgun. The slug punched through its reactor housing. The explosion was visible across the entire nebula. The Draken line broke. It started slowly, a few ships turning away, their formation dissolving at the edges. Then it spread, ship after ship broke off, their drives flaring as they fled into the nebula. Within an hour, the entire Draken fleet was in full retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, not a repositioning. A retreat. The first one in Draken history. The combined fleet did not pursue. They were too damaged, too exhausted, too reduced, but they had held, they had won. In the silence that followed the battle, Danny sat in his chair on the Longhorn's battered bridge and listened to the damage reports. 23 human ships lost, 41 coalition ships lost, thousands of people dead on both sides. Was it worth it? Lisa asked quietly. Danny looked at the tactical display, at the empty space where the Draken fleet had been, at the border worlds behind them, still free, still breathing, still alive, because someone had stood between them and the dark. "Ask me tomorrow," he said. 2 weeks later, on a damaged Coalition repair station, Maggie sat on the outer hull of a ship that was too broken to fly anymore. The metal was cold under her legs, and the stars stretched out in every direction like someone had spilled light across black cloth. Sirith sat beside her. The Velhari was thin and silver and still not entirely comfortable being this close to a human, but she had stopped flinching months ago. "I have been asked to update your file in our archives," Sirith said. "The entry on humans, it was classified under mythology. It needs to be moved." "To what?" Maggie asked. "Active allies." Sirith paused. "I have also been asked to add an annotation, a note for anyone who reads the file in the future." "What are you going to write?" She thought about everything she had seen in the last 6 months. She thought about Danny drinking poison on a space station and calling it breakfast. She thought about Nate arguing with admirals who outranked him by a century. She thought about Maggie carrying Pell through enemy fire while talking about tamales. She thought about a species that had lived on a death world, survived everything their planet could throw at them, reached the stars, and then when strangers they had never met asked for help, said yes without hesitation. "I am going to write, do not underestimate them, do not anger them, but above all, do not forget to thank them." It was a small, tired smile, the kind that comes after you've been awake too long and lost too much and fought too hard, but you're still here, and the people you fought for are still here, and that has to be enough because it's all there is. "You don't have to thank us," Maggie said. "Why not?" Maggie looked up at the stars, millions of them scattered across a galaxy that was older and stranger and more full of life than she had ever imagined. Growing up in San Antonio, somewhere out there, the Drakari were regrouping. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more losses, more long nights on broken ships in cold space. But the tide had turned, and it had turned because someone asked for help, and someone else showed up. "Because you asked," she said. "That was enough." Sirith looked at her for a long time. Then she made her note in the file, saved it, and closed it. The entry on humans was moved from mythology to active allies, and underneath the species designation in small, careful text, Sirith added her annotation. It would be read by millions in the years to come, by soldiers and scientists, by children in schools and elders in council chambers, by every species in a coalition that would never forget the day the myths walked out of legend and took the front line. "Do not underestimate them. Do not anger them, but above all, do not forget to thank them."